double-digit increases in pricing. I mean, we're at 14% first 2 months of this year compared to the first 2 months of last year. It's been double-digit appreciation for years now. Inventory continues to get kind of cut in half. We've got less than 1,000 properties available for sale. We've got 8,000 people that are selling real estate. It's quite a market. And so because you could take this conversation in so many different directions, but one of the main issues that we have is that because prices are moving up so quickly, historically around 38 to 40% of all purchases should be first-time home buyers. We're in the low 20% right now. So, that's a third of the population that simply cannot buy a home. If you're looking at the average sales price in the Tri-County area, it's just a touch over $500,000 now. If you're using prevailing interest rates, if you're a strong borrower, if you're putting a decent amount down, you've got to make over $100,000 a year just to afford the average priced home here. And so, where does it stop? Where do we go from here? I think that I don't think anybody's going to really have the answer to that question. I do think there are some interesting things to look at, affordable housing certainly being one of them. But then you think about all the folks that have moved here from other parts of the country that have been kind of given this hall pass to say, hey, you're going to stay on your New Jersey salary or your Virginia salary or your California salary, but you can go and live wherever you want. And so their perception of value for real estate is simply different than our local perception of value. You go to California and live in a 2-bed, 1-bath shoebox and it costs you $1 million. You come to Mount Pleasant, buy a 3,000 plus square foot house, you feel like you're getting a deal. It doesn't matter if you're going to pay $20,000, $30,000, $50,000 more than the next buyer or how much they're asking. But what happens if those people that have moved here get called back? That might be one of the solutions to inventory, but the challenge is that the move-up buyer is kind of caught in a hard place. In other words, the first-time home buyer is the person that buys the first-time home seller's house, and everything kind of trickles upward. But we've also historically had a lot of relocation and a lot of second home interest in Charleston. So, I used to think that I could predict where this market was going, and I'm just not so sure when this will stop. I will say, though, that if you look at kind of why we are where we are with regard to price appreciation, the drop in interest rates that occurred right after kind of the initial shock of COVID, right after the stay-at-home orders were lifted, that drop in interest rate, or ultimately that payment, mimicked the increase or the appreciation that we saw. So it actually didn't really cost anybody that much more money in order to buy a more expensive home. And over the years, we've had these kind of financial incentives built into the market that made moving a little easier. Maybe somebody had a 4.5%, 5% interest rate home, and they went and they bought a house that was 30% more expensive. But if they could lock into an interest rate that was 30% less, then really the payment didn't change, and so now they've got a bigger, better home. It didn't really cost them anything. Now we've, of course, returned to the idea that if you want to buy something more expensive, it's simply going to cost you more money. The question is, where does it stop? And I think that obviously the answer is going to be the increase in interest rates that we're seeing.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people here like the idea that all the people who moved here from the Northeast are suddenly going to get called back to work and free up some housing for everybody else. One of the interesting things is that Brian touched on is the lack of places to buy. And of course, rents have been going through the roof as well. And at the same time, anyone who's been over the bridge lately, the Charleston Peninsula is covered with construction cranes, and buildings just seem to be rising one after another. I want to throw this to Chris for a second, because I sort of made a bet here before we started, and now I'm going to test my theory. How many people in this room, just put up a hand, are aware that the population on the Charleston Peninsula has been falling since 1950? Okay, all right, cool, got a couple hands. Well, now that seems to be at a turning point, because if people occupy all these things being built, that's almost certain to change. Chris, can you tell us, and I'm sorry, Christopher, can you tell us a little bit about what we're seeing right now on the peninsula, and also how the city is working to make sure that mostly higher end growth ends up benefiting everybody and not just turning the peninsula into a place for rich people.
Nice to see everybody today. Happy to be here. So on the peninsula, I think we're seeing, number one, a phenomenon that's going on in cities around the country, which is a return to downtown areas, center city areas. Also the fact that a lot of people across the country aren't buying houses as early in their lives as they have in the past. So you've got a pretty young population that wants to live in center cities everywhere, and Charleston is a particularly desirable center city. So you're seeing tremendous amounts of multifamily construction in downtown Charleston that is, filling up pretty rapidly. But we're also seeing a really big boom in office space. We're having perhaps the biggest boom in office space that we've ever had in the history of the city over the last 5-6 years. Between what has recently been completed and then what is under construction, we've got well over 1 million square feet of office, which for this region, that's a huge amount of office space. And so some of those cranes you see going on downtown are offices. There are a few hotels that are under construction too, and we've had steady construction of hotels in the downtown for many, many years. But it is the residential that is probably creating the biggest dynamic. Some of the positive things about the residential that's coming is almost all of it is within close proximity to the new Low Country Rapid Transit line, which means that the folks who live in those units will have the best transit system we've ever had in this region available immediately to them, basically outside their door or within a 5-minute walk. That line is going to come down Meeting Street essentially through the city, and all the development that's on Meeting Street as well as the development that's on Morrison Drive and King Street areas as well is in close proximity to that. So it is going to be a fairly transit-friendly community as those are defined. But one of the things that we're doing, and part of David's question here was, what is the city doing to make sure we're creating housing for everyone? And almost every one of the developments that you see going up downtown that has housing in it is either providing affordable housing on site or is contributing to a fee in lieu fund that is set up by the city to build more affordable housing. The zoning that people request for these developments is what triggers that. In other words, they ask for this type of zoning, and it requires that if you're going to get that zoning, you've got to have affordable units within it. We also have in the Upper Peninsula area, in the Morrison Drive area, a very incentive-based zoning where you actually earn the height for your building based on how you deliver things like public spaces, amenities for bicyclists and pedestrians, for electric vehicles, for affordable housing, for unique or sustainable energy sources such as solar, such as wind power, things like that. So some of the height you get generated by earning those points in that system in the Upper Peninsula is coming from a variety of sources there.
Yeah, and let me just add on something Christopher said. That one of the interesting things Charleston's been doing is the incentives and requirements for affordable housing in new construction. Mount Pleasant tried that and then decided pretty quickly that they didn't like it after all. And it was the idea that you could get more height or build more units if you made some of them affordable, which is what Charleston still does. And Mount Pleasant gave that a try. I think there might have been 2 developments, and one of them was the beach company's boulevard apartments, which broke kind of a big backlash here in town. And then the town decided we actually don't want to tell anyone they can have more height or more density if they make some of it affordable, and they did away with that. But Christopher, you mentioned the bus rapid transit line, and that's Catherine Bosch's specialty here, and I'm going to ask her to tell us a little bit more about it. As we all know, we don't really have much in the way of mass transit here, and this is probably the one big new initiative that I remember when I covered the initial early stages of it. The idea was we were going to have a train from Charleston to Somerville, and then that kind of went away. We're not going to have a train. We're going to have a bus, but it's more than a bus, and you can tell us why.
Yeah, we actually looked at commuter rail. Probably 2005. We did a study for commuter rail through the region, and if you think of transit in terms of a progression, You could go from buses to light rail to commuter rail. That used to be your options, and then you needed more density, and you needed more density further out from the city center in order to justify the cost and investment that went into all of that. Back in about 10 years ago, we did a study because we showed that commuter rail was not feasible in the region, even though everybody said, well, we'll just go on Norfolk Southern's rail lines. You know, they don't use them all that much. And Norfolk Southern said, no, you're not. But aside from that, we just didn't have the growth and the development and the density to justify it. So we did a study called I-26 Alt, and we started looking at, so what are the options for us to have a fixed guideway transit system in the region? Well, if you think about it this way, light rail would have cost us something like $3.2 billion to put in. You put the rails lines into the pavement, and it's fixed. I mean, you can't deviate, you can't do anything. Well, in recent years, while we were doing that, bus rapid transit has become kind of the premier response to transit systems across the United States, and you see them coming up in a lot of places, the first one being in Cleveland, and it's been very successful. So bus rapid transit, yes, it's buses, but they are different. They operate like light rail, but they are not in a fixed guideway in terms of there's no rail lines built into the pavement. So they operate in a separate lane, in which this case we're going to have down the middle of Rivers Avenue. If you drive Rivers Avenue, you see that great big median in the middle. Well, there'll be bus rapid transit coming down through there, and it pulls up to stops, and it opens the doors, and you get on and off, and you flash your card, and it just, if you've ever ridden the metro, it operates just like a metro, basically, but it's buses. And if we have flooding downtown, we can deviate around floods. We have a lot more flexibility with bus rapid transit. So we just finished our project development. We're waiting to hear this month from FTA about receiving the rest of the funding to actually construct this. If that's the case, we will be in engineering within the next few months. And the engineering will take about 2 years. That's the detailed engineering. We're at about 30% plans at this point, and be under construction. The line will go from the fairgrounds to downtown over to the medical district. There's about 20 stops. The bus will run every 10 minutes, so it's one answer to moving people through the region in terms of accommodating the growth that's coming through. So our office basically works on how do we accommodate the growth that's coming.
And when are we actually going to be able to ride this bus?
We're looking at 2028.
Okay, 2028. So still quite a ways off, but yeah, it's getting a little bit closer to what everyone says they need in order to actually use rapid transit, which is to have something that's frequent and reliable and ubiquitous, or maybe not ubiquitous in this case, but frequent and reliable, we hope. And then this all circles back into the density debate, though, which is always a debate with growth and development, where in order to have successful mass transit, you need to have relatively dense residential development near the places mass transit exists, right? Which comes first? Which is the chicken? Which is the egg? And I don't want to just keep directing questions to one person. You all can jump in on this, because I'd like to hear some thoughts on whether we think it's really likely that people are going to build dense residential developments because of the bus rapid transit line, because that's the thinking, right?
And it has been proven. I mentioned Cleveland, even Richmond, Virginia just opened their bus rapid transit line, and they're already seeing it. So bus rapid transit tends to attract up to 3 times more of the development that's coming into an area than it would have otherwise. And so what you end up creating around the stations is transit-oriented development, which is very mixed use, very walkable, very similar to what you're seeing happening downtown. You'll just see more of that kind of going up across the line. There'll be, you'll see different types of stations, though. Some stations might be just neighborhood stations where you're the people who are using it are coming from the neighborhoods that already exist and that are maybe, for instance, I worked with the North Charleston on their comprehensive plan. There's a lot of opportunity for infill development in some of the older neighborhoods, so the neighborhoods don't get disrupted. But at the same time, if you've been up Rivers Avenue, recently, and gone by Shipwatch Square, that intersection doesn't look anything like it looked like 2 years ago when our office was over there. You already have people who are coming in and starting to invest in those areas where they know that the stations have been identified. So I don't think it'll
And
take
I can add a
much.
little bit on that. The intersection Catherine's talking about at Rivers and McMillan Avenue, that's where the former Charleston Naval Hospital is located. You all might know it as the tallest building in North Charleston, the one that Charleston County lost $35 million trying to redevelop. But it's going to be, I think at this point, 300 and some apartments when it's redeveloped. And across the street is the county's new social services building, and that's where one of the big bus rapid transit stops is going to be. But Brian, what do you think? I mean, is a rapid bus line enough to get people to come in and build new dense developments?
I think so. I mean, if you think about the folks that move here that understand how kind of interactive our community is, right? We're a very active community, a lot to do, but we really lack developments that allow you to do something without hopping in your car. So a lot of people have a craving for that.
Right, and it's also part of the key to the traffic problems. Maybe not the key, but maybe a little small key. Because, I mean, here in Mount Pleasant particularly, we hear all the time about how businesses have trouble getting employees because the employees can't afford to live in Mount Pleasant, and they end up having to commute from, Ladd Center or wherever. And there's no way to get here except in a car. Where do the cars go? The cars go on I-26. And it's a mess. And then we end up spending literally billions of dollars widening the roads. I think right now there's a plan to basically widen I-526 from West Ashley all the way to Mount Pleasant, and that plan has I want to say $7 billion price tag, something like that. I mean, it's just phenomenal. So mass transit is increasingly becoming something we're talking about more here, but the first part of it might be the rapid bus line in 2028. In the meantime, a lot of the other development we're seeing, at least in the Charleston area, is going on what used to be the outer fringes of the city. Johns Island, the far end of West Ashley, out past Bees Ferry Road, the Cainhoy Peninsula above Daniel Island. And some of these developments are enormous. I think the Cainhoy Peninsula, what are they calling that one?
Point Hope.
Point Hope, yeah. So if I remember right, it's approved for 9,200 homes.
It's actually more than that. It's actually more than that, but they're telling us right now they'll probably build out at about 10,000 houses.
Okay, just 10,000 houses.
Yeah.
So that's about 25,000 people, 27,000 people. And we're seeing more and more developments like that in our area, especially out in Berkeley County where you have Nexton and Cane Bay and Carnes Crossroads. Town-sized developments coming one after the other around the edges of the developed Tri-County area. And I think the question I hear a lot is, why is the government, the school districts, the government that deals with building things like roads, not sort of more out in front of these? Why do we instead get something like a Cane Bay on a 2-lane road where with many thousands of people living there? And then the government has to come back in and at taxpayer expense widen the road, just like we've seen in Mount Pleasant with Highway 41, just like we're seeing with the $7 billion widening of 526. Catherine, I'm going to throw this to you first since you're the regional planning person. Could the governments be doing more to get out ahead of this? Or as opposed to what we seem to be seeing or have seen up to this point, which is developments with 5, 7, 8, 10,000 homes approved, sometimes on 2-lane roads, and then a mad scramble later to figure out where to put the cars and the school students and so on.
Well, it all comes down to planning, and I don't know that 20 years ago, a lot of our jurisdictions thought that we were really going to have this much development. As you said, in 2010, when we did our regional plan, we had predicted that 880,000 people would be here, not knowing that we would hit that 20 years earlier than we expected. But when you're doing the planning, we kind of anticipate the growth, and we anticipate what some of that infrastructure is that's going to be needed. But regardless of how much you plan what you're going to need, and if you plan well and know what you need, it comes down to how much money it's going to cost to put it in the ground. So I always say that, you know, our challenges are nothing that a lot of money couldn't fix, but it also takes a lot of time to put that infrastructure in place. So when you're planning ahead, or when developments are coming in and they're asking for rezonings and development approvals, you really have to look at what that infrastructure demand is going to be. And it's not just roads, and it also comes down to water and sewer capacity. Berkeley County is struggling with that now. It's looking at where it's going to have to add some additional sewage treatment plants because of the growth that's come in there. And if you think about it, only about 50% of Berkeley County has grown at this point. There's a lot of rural areas. You know, a third of it is the National Forest. National Forest is now starting to look at, should we turn over some of our property to be developed? So it's a challenge, but hopefully with some additional infrastructure money coming our way, we can get ahead of some of those projects and get those in place.
Yeah, and Christopher, I want to ask you the sort of government philosophy question here, because I mean, one of the things we hear a lot in the public is basically, can't you just do something to slow the growth? Can't you maybe even stop the growth? And some governments have tried. Mount Pleasant has tried. I mean, Mount Pleasant has limited the number of building permits they'll issue every year. They've restricted the height that buildings can be, which obviously restricts how many people can live in those buildings. They've passed more regulations involving how much of a property you can cover with impervious surfaces, which means smaller houses, less subdivision of lots. They've imposed impact fees. But it seems like the governments that are really focused on how can we slow or restrict growth tend to be the ones like Mount Pleasant, which are essentially built out. The growth's already come, it's already happened. What about Charleston? What's the philosophy there about embracing rather than slowing growth?
Well, I think it's all about having growth in the right places and creating the density in the key corridors that we would want it to be in because of the ability to have walkable communities, the ability to have transit. You know, in the city, we worked with Charleston County back in the late 90s to create the urban growth boundary that we have honored since it's been created, that creates areas around, for instance, only about 20% or so of Johns Island can be developed in an urban fashion because of the urban growth boundary. And then in West Ashley, we have a outer edge there that is reinforced with the largest park that's going to be in Charleston County on the outer edges of Long Savannah that will create a kind of permanent edge to the development in the West Ashley area and the Highway 61 area. And that urban growth boundary also has implications for James Island, and then Cainhoy, it follows the boundaries of the Francis Marion Forest. So I think that that's really important, and we've tried to concentrate our density along the key routes, particularly in the downtown, some areas of West Ashley, and some of the key intersections around our city. But we also discussed our planning commission discussed when we were working on our new city plan or our comprehensive plan in the last year, you know, what is a no growth type approach and what were the impacts? And we have a long section in there about what the ultimate impacts are, which is such things as no more affordable housing, the ability to have housing that more folks can get to is compromised, it curtails job growth, all these types of things. And I think we've got a lot of things in the city of Charleston and our Charleston region to build on, because we've got some density and some cohesiveness in the right places. The bus rapid transit is fantastic. The fact that the bus rapid transit leads to the location of the highest employment in all of South Carolina, being the medical district downtown, which even with Roper leaving that area, still I believe will be the area of highest employment, because I think it still will be over 20,000 employees in that one area. And some of this looks at, how do we approach these things at a state level? Look at all the money that has gone from the state to help us get Volvo in this area, which is a great addition to our community. But the hundreds of millions of dollars of improvements to get Volvo here, and yet we've got 10 times the jobs of Volvo at the medical district, and we've struggled, and thankfully the state has helped us, but we've struggled to get some money to help with the drainage situation there. The state has given us some money for some of the tunnel work that's going to happen there. But it's very important that we look at where our jobs are, where our densities are, and try to focus our funds for infrastructure in those areas.
Thanks, and I'm going to throw out one more question here, and then we're going to take some from the audience, because what we think is interesting might not be the same as what you all do today. But Brian, I'm going to throw you a question we've talked about before, because I just keep going over it in my head. We hear all the time that part of the reason why we don't have enough affordable housing, or just, in the sense of housing people can afford, is that there's just not enough of it. It's not being built quickly enough. I think you said there were 1,000 maybe homes on the market and 6,000 realtors trying to sell them. We did a story, I want to say 4 years ago, where we looked at how many homes have already been permitted in the Tri-County area but haven't been built yet. And the number we came up with was 105,000. So my question keeps being, if there's this great demand, if prices are soaring, if people desperately need houses, and the problem is there aren't enough of them, why aren't the 105,000 homes that have already been permitted being built more quickly? I know you're not a builder, but you might have something to say about it.
Well, my guess on that would be that if you look at the fact that material costs have gone through the roof, that labor issues are real issues. Hire a contractor right now to go and get work done on your house or to build a house. It's tough to find somebody, and with contractors especially, or builders, you've got kind of two different mentalities. You've got the folks that know their worth. They're going to say what they can do and what they can't do and what they have time for and what they don't have time for. But then you've got the other folks that are going to say yes to any job that comes their way out of fear that if they say no, well, then they'll never get an opportunity from that person again. And so it just creates these backlogs. But I would think that there are plenty of people that are kind of in a holding pattern right now, hoping that materials will come down. And all the while that land is becoming more expensive. So you're also seeing a lot of folks, us as well, investing in land. For the first time in quite a long time, land is kind of an attractive investment that's moving rapidly. Think about all the folks that bought back in the mid to late 2000s with the idea of building, that then had to basically hold it. If they didn't turn it into the bank, they had to hold it for 10 plus years in order for it to now be worth more than what they bought it for 10, 12 years ago, and actually sell it and make a profit. So there's some money to be made on the land side of things too. But that would be my guess, is just increased labor costs, materials costs. It takes a while to build a house right now.
Right. I realize when you have something like Point Hope with its almost 10,000 homes, they can't just decide to build them all right now because the market's hot. There are all sorts of reasons why they can, and one of them is development agreements that spell out how many they can potentially build each year, I think. But let's take a pause there and see if we have some questions from the audience that you want all or some of us to answer. Just put your hand up. We don't have a mic to go around, so just speak up and I'll repeat the question. Sir.
Question for Christopher regarding affordable housing. What percentage do you ask be affordable, and how many developers do you find building those affordable units versus then being?
I'm just going to repeat the question first in case people didn't hear it in the back. The question was, what percentage of developers agree to build affordable housing rather than just pay the city instead of building the affordable housing? Is that the gist of it?
So it varies with the type of development and what part of the city you're in, and we've also really ratcheted up the fee in lieu to make it much more expensive than it was, say, 5 or 6 years ago. Some of these projects are things that you haven't seen yet come out of the ground, but for example, the new Courier Square Phase 2 is under that requirement, and they're going to have on-site affordable housing in that development. But a lot of the developments in the past, like West Edge, because they were under an old structure of the MU zoning, paid into the fee in lieu. I think we've collected $12 or $13 million in the fee in lieu, which has already gone out to buy land, to build affordable units. There have been some affordable units built in Ashleyville, Maryville. There are affordable units the Housing Authority is building. There are several hundred in the area around Lee and Meeting Street that will be built over the next few years in that location that will be purely affordable developments in the midst of all these market rate developments as well. So it does vary. Because South Carolina does not allow us to require affordability across the board when we have our new single-family developments, unless they come in with a zoning request for like a planned unit development, we can't require affordable housing in those developments. But when we get the PUDs, planned unit developments, we very often can, and those vary in range from 5 to 10 to 15% of affordable units in the planned unit developments. For example, those can be satisfied in many ways, like the Magnolia Development on the peninsula is dedicating 1.5 acres, which doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a site that could hold, a couple hundred units on it by virtue of the density that's allowed there. So Magnolia has affordability. Laurel Island has an even greater level of affordability, which is up in the range of 20% on that site.
And let me jump in real quick with a little context. The Magnolia Development, for anyone who's not familiar with it, was proposed back in the early 2000s before the Great Recession. It's on the Ashley River in the Neck area, and it's what they call a brownfield site. A lot of it is or was a Superfund site where they did phosphate fertilizer businesses and creosote coating of telephone poles and all sorts of horrible things. And because of the demand for development and places to put things, there's been this multi-year, very expensive cleanup of that land, and now it's going to be a mixed-use development. And the other one Christopher mentioned is, if you go across the bridge and you see this great big green space that looks like a park along the river on the Charleston side, that used to be a landfill, and now it's going to be another giant mixed-use development. How many homes?
I believe it could be up to like 6,000 or 8,000.
Right,
it depends
so,
on the overall development pattern.
Right. These are two town-sized developments happening at the north end of the peninsula that both will include affordable housing. And when we say that, affordable housing in that context is middle-class housing.
Right.
It's not the housing the Charleston Housing Authority handles for low to middle-income people. And I know that's usually a point of some discussion. Who else had a question? Ma'am.
So we're seeing a lot of new trends and just things that we never could anticipate before. Like, so one of the things I'm reading is about how new companies are now coming in and buying some of that affordable, kind of housing. What structures do we have in place to kind of respond to some of these new trends that we never anticipated before, to make sure that affordable housing is there for individuals and not companies?
Sure. So the question was about what, if anything, can we do about this trend of companies and hedge funds coming in and buying up all the affordable housing in order to turn it into rental property. And that's something we haven't seen as much here, but I know in some areas, hedge funds have come in and bought up entire neighborhoods of single-family homes and turned them into rental properties. We have seen that here with apartment complexes. We've seen companies from all over the country come in and buy some of the most affordable apartment buildings, I think in West Ashley. And they'll fix them up a little bit and raise the rent. What can the government do about it? I'm going to say I don't think anything.
In Charleston, if somebody is doing affordable housing, there are deed restrictions that are placed on the property. So you have to, no matter who owns it, follow through on that obligation for affordability. Now, sometimes there are time limits. Sometimes the affordable units are only for like 30 years, and at the end of 30 years, they can go to market rate. There also are lots of things called tax credit projects that have, 10 or 20-year affordability requirements, and then they go to market rate. But if the city builds it, or if somebody's doing it to meet city requirements, we typically get deed restrictions.
Right, that's true. If the apartments or homes were built as affordable housing, there are some restrictions on keeping them affordable. But if someone wants to if your house is for sale and some company wants to come in and buy it and turn it into a rental property, there's nothing to stop them from doing that. Just like there's nothing to stop them from buying a whole apartment complex unless it's in some way deed restricted. Are there any more questions right now? Sir?
I personally love the idea of bus rapid transit for those reasons, but I'm wondering, is that a done deal with traffic? Are there any obstacles in its way, like right-of-ways, federal?
I can't think of any actual obstacles. What Charleston County, basically with the last transportation improvement tax referendum, put aside the 50% match that we need from to match Federal Transit Administration giving us the grant. We've gone through a lot of processes and just finished going over another hurdle where a management company looked at whether or not this is really feasible, something that our region can manage, and they've given the recommendation to Federal Transit, so it's a matter of that. And as long as we stay on that same trajectory in terms of following what we had originally thought of conceptually and can engineer it, and it comes in within that cost, we should be fine. So I don't know, other than some major disaster happening, but even, with a hurricane, things, we're a pretty resilient region, so I think we'll be fine in getting it to happen. But
Do we have anyone, ma'am?
Is there any movement, organization doing work to improve the quality of labor for construction? We're having such a boom that the quality doesn't seem to be there for your applications. And there's such a shortage, and the prices are being, driven so high for construction because there's not the labor, there's not the quality, and there aren't classes at Trident Tech for home building.
Interesting question. Yeah.
The electricity is because the power company backs it. They pay for the equipment.
So the question was, is anyone doing anything about improving the quality of the construction workforce? And I'm not really sure who to throw that one to up here. Brian, you have any? No? Christopher?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
At Trident Tech, a couple years ago, I was talking with Mary Moreland, and she said that electricians are trained there because the power company gives the equipment. But for home building, there needs to be some source of income to back it, and that hasn't happened. It seems like that would be a really good idea.
Yeah, I mean that's an interesting idea, and it sounds like we don't have an answer for you. But I'll ask a related one, because the quality of construction is certainly an issue that we've written about at the paper. I recall writing a story 2 or 3 years ago about how the vast majority of recently built multifamily buildings in this area have construction defects and end up in lawsuits, which causes all sorts of problems. And I'm talking about apartment buildings and condo buildings. I think we counted close to 50 of them that were in litigation at the time that I wrote the story. Christopher, what can you tell me about just how much oversight local governments have when things are being built to make sure that they're not in litigation with rain pouring through the improperly done flashing 2 years later?
Yeah, so our inspection process obviously makes sure things are built to basic international building codes, but that usually is looking at, the electrical wiring, that's looking at how the plumbing is done, the structural integrity. I don't know enough about the building inspection process to know how much the inspections deal with the waterproofing and things, but it does seem like there's been an incredible epidemic of water intrusion issues within multifamily developments around town. And so then they have to get shrouded and reskinned and that kind of thing. But I know that we do have the process of the building inspection for the structural integrity and all those related systems to a structure. And then in the downtown area, the exteriors are inspected to make sure that they meet the standards that the Board of Architectural Review is looking for. So the brickwork and the types of windows and the workmanship and those details.
Yeah, and I sort of related to that, Brian, let me ask you, with the real estate market being just as ridiculously overheated as it is, we keep hearing about the things that buyers have to do to make their offers stand out, and one of those things people are doing is waiving inspections. How bad of an idea is that?
How much time do you have? I mean, really, it's all about how much propensity you have for risk. In this market, again, I think a lot of it revolves around that particular buyer's perception of value. If they just sold their home, if nationally we're looking at double-digit increases in appreciation, and they just banked hundreds of thousands of dollars in a market they've moved to, what's a few $1,000s if something comes up that they didn't know about because they didn't get a home inspection? I mean, that's kind of the mentality that some of these buyers have. Obviously, it also has to do with where the property is. Is it in a flood zone? Is it on a slab? Is it on a crawl space? Is it newer? Is it older? I mean, there's a lot of factors that come into play there. And not every home that hits the market is in a multiple offer situation where people have to start thinking about waiving their home inspection contingencies or their appraisal contingencies, but a lot of them are. And so, I think a lot of people gravitate toward the multiple offer situation and how it kind of benefits the seller in terms of how much extra money they can put in their pocket. I don't think there's enough emphasis right now being put on how to deal with that if you're a buyer and not overpay or leave yourself so open to those kinds of issues that you just make a poor financial decision.
Thanks, Brian. Do we have any other, sir?
Our business sells water, sewer, storm, big utilities, and the comment earlier about one of the contributing factors that's taking so long is literally the supply. I mean, it is very high or very competitive, but that's not as much of an issue as just the availability of the product. So that's a big deal. It's literally gone from, I don't know, a couple of weeks to be able to get materials for development, let's say, to a year.
Right, just can't get the supplies fast enough.
That's been a big issue. So that was just one comment. The other thing is that the issue we're having trying to hire, in our contractors, trying to hire people, they can't find, especially younger people, because I think that we can't bring them in from out of the area because they can't afford to live there. I mean, that's been a big issue. We've had a couple of people who interviewed, and we'd love to have them, like, oh my gosh, my apartment here versus, other places. Now, if they're moving to Seattle, it's different, but if they're moving from Greenville or Columbia or some other place, it's a lot easier for Charlotte. I mean, we just can't get young people in our contracts anyway.
Right. The affordability issue has been a huge problem for lots of employers, and that's probably going to be a subject for another day's seminar, because it's so complicated. Let me ask you one thing about that, Christopher. I mean, Charleston has done a lot with affordability in terms of creating rentals and homes. And one of the questions I have sometimes asked the city, I'm going to put you on the spot with it, is how do people find out where these affordable units are and if they're available or not?
That's a very good question. And I know our housing and community development folks have workers assigned to helping with getting people on wait lists and things like that. And of course, the housing authority does things like that. But it probably would make some sense to have a better clearinghouse, maybe on a regional scale, that has all of the affordable locations listed. You know, there's so many different levels of affordability too. Things like, pure, government subsidized housing to Section 8 to, the units that are in the newer projects that are being developed in the city that have to meet the affordability requirements. So having a database of all that, and particularly between jurisdictions, would probably be a really good thing to have.
Right, yeah, because I think probably a lot of people aren't aware that a lot of the higher-end apartment complexes on the peninsula have affordable units in them, but you're not going to see it on their website. You're not going to find out about it unless you happen to know about it. And they tend to be for middle-income people. And it's been a challenge. I saw a question by the ma'am.
Growth apparently is a dirty word to most people in Mount Pleasant. Growth,
Mhm.
affordable homes, affordable housing. You mention those words, and it gets a great public outcry. That's why Mount Pleasant has such a building moratorium in place. So if you can't grow from within, you have to grow without. So you can Berkeley County new projects that are coming in. So you build out there, then you've got the new roads, the new infrastructure that comes into place. Then you've got the additional traffic. So everyone starts complaining about the traffic and the cost of all the new infrastructure. Redevelopment, I see, is a great way to build from within. But how do we get redevelopment really going? How do we change the tide of public perception of affordable homes? What can we do to try to massage the situation to make it better?
Wow, now that's that's a lot. And the question was, if I'm going to try to boil it down to what can we do to change the perception of affordable housing and increase more affordable infill development? Does anybody want to try that one? That's a lot. No? Christopher?
I mean,
Everyone's
I
looking at
might
you.
say that when you look at downtown and all the development that's going on in the downtown, every one of those sites in downtown Charleston is a redevelopment site. They're sites that either were marginally utilized or had, buildings that weren't, historic or whatever on them, or they have a historic building on the site that's being renovated as part of the newer development that's adjacent to it. So I think that there is that aspect that, in a denser environment, you have the ability to attract interest in the redevelopment. But then we have other areas of the city, like we'd love to see a lot of redevelopment in West Ashley, particularly the commercial areas, because West Ashley neighborhoods are in great shape. It's our commercial areas in West Ashley that are in tougher shape, and particularly areas like along Sam Rittenberg, where you've got older shopping centers, things like that, that would be perfect. They're high and dry, they're in proximity to jobs and transit and things like that. They would be perfect locations for greater density of residential along them. But sometimes you get, ownership groups that are making what they want to out of it and are not motivated, and it would take, huge, probably density bonuses on the part of the city, maybe some low interest loans, things like that. And I say low interest loans because that wouldn't work in the past, but now that interest rates are going, it may be something that has more viability. But definitely there are areas that we need to target in our own city of Charleston to encourage that. So I think it's something our whole region needs to keep working on.
Yeah, and the question seemed to focus a bit on Mount Pleasant, am I right? I mean, I don't speak for the town, and I'm not going to venture into how to change people's opinions, because that's not what I do. But I have covered Mount Pleasant a lot, and I'll tell you what they are doing, which is essentially the opposite of what you're suggesting they should do. I mean, Mount Pleasant, the government, of course, reacts to what the voters want, or what the government perceives the voters want. And what they seem to want in Mount Pleasant is less growth, less development, more limits on things. So when you talk about infill development and affordable housing in Mount Pleasant, there's not really much going on in terms of affordable housing. And in terms of infill, the town has set up rules to very strictly limit what can be done, especially when it comes to residential development. Like right over down the street here, down Houston Northcutt Boulevard, is the old Cinnabar movie theater complex, which is large property that's currently in the process of redevelopment talks. And when the town did their comprehensive plan, they very specifically said, no one's going to build a tall residential building there. And a lot of the town's plans are along that road. It's more about limiting what can happen rather than encouraging more of it. More questions? One more question? Oh, that's tough. Gosh, I think this person's had their hand up the longest. I'm going to point to the back.
Okay, so I live on John's Island, and you're talking about 100,000 permits that have been permitted. It feels like sometimes when a developer is talking about coming in and building in a rural area, that they say, well, that was permitted back in 2013, and there's nothing that we can do about that. We don't really have to allow it to go through as long as there is infrastructure there. And I wonder if there's any way to actually sunset some of those permits or have them go away and do a rethinking of what's going to happen in the areas.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. And it goes, I think everyone could probably hear it because it came from the back, but for the tape, the gist of it was, what can we do about permits that turn out to have been issued many, many, many years ago and just seem to keep going on, even as the things the community might want or the things the government might want keep changing. I know just a little bit about this, which is that, developers have what they call vested rights, and you apply for something and you get permission to do it. And then after some period of time, that goes away, but the state recently, over the last decade, I think, has kept extending that, partly during the Great Recession, because a lot of people had approved plans that were going to sunset before the recession was over. But at this point, I think developers get automatic renewals repeatedly, that the government doesn't have any choice but to approve, right, Christopher?
Yeah, it depends on the type of renewal and type of development approval they have. Is it a development agreement, which is only the biggest developments? Like, I don't think we have any development agreements, I don't think, on John's Island with developers, but there are planned unit developments that run with the land, and so those entitlements are pretty much locked in. And then there's basic zoning, our standard zoning categories that more or less run with the land unless city council chooses to change them. On John's Island, again, at least in the city, because of the urban growth boundary and because of our plans, we don't allow intensive development in the rural areas. In fact, we don't have rural areas within the city limits on John's Island, essentially. There are some areas outside the urban growth boundary under county jurisdiction that are seeing some development, but even that is in line with the county's plans of, say, no more than 1 unit an acre or something like that. But I'd have to look at the specific things you were talking about and would be happy to. But in general, the development rights, because South Carolina is so property rights oriented, kind of run with the land. But you do get in more complicated situations, like particularly with downtown projects, where there might have been a Board of Appeals case that was giving a variance to a particular project or something like that, and that has to be renewed periodically. Board of Architectural Review approvals have to be renewed periodically to keep in line.
Yeah, but I think the question does go to some of what I've seen a lot in my 30 years of being a reporter, is that by the time the public becomes aware of a development, it's often at the point where trees are being cut down. And then if you look into it, it turns out, like Indigo Square here in Mount Pleasant, but then it turns out that what they're doing was approved 6 years earlier, 10 years earlier, 12 years earlier. And I guess one of the things that I hope we at the newspaper do that has a little bit of added value is we go to a lot of the boring meetings where they do these things that most people understandably wouldn't want to be at. I mean, we go to the zoning meetings and the planning meetings and sit in on the comprehensive plan discussions that most people in there just have better things to do. So hopefully we can keep people at least somewhat informed. A lot of the things I'm kind of getting the wrap it up signal, so I'm just going to remind everybody that a lot of the things we've been talking about today are things we've been writing about in depth for the past 2 years, and you can find a lot of them on our website. We've got a special page for them. It's postandcourier.com/boom and balance, and we're going to keep on doing it. We have to wrap up the mic part of this, but I'll be here for a little bit more if anybody has some questions for me, and our panelists probably want to go have some lunch. But thank you all so much for coming out today, and enjoy the rest of your day.